μιλάς.
Okay. Good evening to everyone attending this evening on Teams and on the Money Space live stream. Καλησπέρα σε όλους που μας παρακολουθείτε σήμερα. Welcome to Sparta Live, an online program of lively workshops themed around the history, archaeology and legacy of Sparta and Laconia, hosted jointly by the Center for Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies of the University of Nottingham and the city of Sparta, the site of ancient Sparta in Greece. I'm Chrysanthi Galou, Associate Professor of Archaeology and the Director of the Center, and today I'm joined by the Mayor of Sparta, Mr. Petros Doukas, and my colleagues, Dr. Alberto Esu, Assistant Professor in Ancient History, and Dr. Matt Thompson, Teaching Associate in Ancient History here at Nottingham. Without further ado, I'll first pass over to Mayor Doukas to welcome you all on behalf of the city of Sparta, and then to Alberto, who will introduce today's distinguished speaker. Petros, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chrysanthi, and really we're grateful for what you have been doing to promote and showcase the history and civilization of Sparta. Very, very interesting subject today, because Sparta was also considered a mixed sort of democracy, and we have to see what sort of democracy it was. So very exciting. Hope to see you early summer in Greece, all of you. Come here as our guests. And very, very interested to hear how the functioning of the Spartan democracy was and what its limitations were. So back to you, Alberto.
Sorry. Thank you very much. It's a big pleasure for me to introduce today our speaker, Dr. Matt Simonton, who is Associate Professor of Ancient History at the University of the Arizona State University. Matt's main interests are Greek political and institutional history, political theory, and history of political thought. His first important book, Classical Greek Oligarchy, is the most recent treatment of classical Greek oligarchy, and received in 2018 the Runciman Award from the Anglo-Hellenic League. His most recent publication has focused on Greek epigraphy, political representation in classical Athens, and demagogues in the Hellenistic period. And he's actually currently working on a history of the ancient Greek demagoguery from the 5th century BC to the 2nd century AD. Before introducing giving the room to our speaker, I would like to remind everyone that there is an handout in the chat. You can hand out from the paper. You can access to it using the Google Drive link. Matt will talk to us on why did the Spartan dislike democracy. Thank you very much, Matt. Please.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for that very kind introduction, and to Chrysanthi for organizing, and to Mayor Doukas of Sparta. It's wonderful to have you here as well. As Alberto said, there is a handout in the chat. I'm going to be doing some sort of close readings of passages about the Spartans and democracy, and you can follow along there if you like. I'm also going to now share my slides, so we'll make sure that that works. Everyone can see that okay?
Yes.
And it's full screen, yes? Okay. Yes, there was a note about the handout. It should be in the chat, represented by a Dropbox link. I can also, is anyone else having difficulty accessing it? Because I can put another link in the chat.
I just asked in the chat if people can see the link.
They can't see the link, so
they can't see the link, so probably we
let me share it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can share it from my drive. Because I think it would help to have the link. And now let me put it in the chat. I apologize for the delay. Let's try this. Oh, Chrysanthi put it in there as well.
Chrysanthi has shared it again, so yeah, it's working now.
It's working. Yeah.
Ah, okay, wonderful. Okay, great. So I will go back to sharing my PowerPoint. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so my topic today might seem obvious in that we are, of course, told that Sparta was one of the great oligarchic, or at least pro-oligarchic powers of the ancient Greek world, in contradistinction to its great rival, the Athenian democracy. So we can find all kinds of passages from classical sources talking about Sparta as a supporter of oligarchic regimes other than itself. Very famously, Thucydides in Book 1 describes the Spartans as maintaining their leadership, quote, not by having their allies be subject to tribute, but instead by taking care that, through the imposition of oligarchy, the allies would conduct their political affairs in a manner suitable to the Spartans' interests alone. And I should point out that all translations are mine, unless otherwise noted, and you can see selected passages, the original Greek, in the handout and on the slides. Likewise, Aristotle in his Politics, looking back at the political history of the 5th and 4th centuries, states that, quote, of the states in contention for the hegemony of Greece, that is Athens and Sparta, each looked to its own constitution as a model, the former setting up democracies in the cities, the latter oligarchies. And from a later source, Diodorus Siculus states that, quote, the Spartans, strongly disliking democracies, wanted the cities to be administered by an oligarchic regime. So it's clear that Sparta favored oligarchies. Much later, even than Diodorus, a quotation attributed by Plutarch to the great lawgiver Lycurgus says, to a man demanding that a democracy be established in the city, Lycurgus responded, you set one up in your own household first. So, of course, this is sort of doubly anachronistic in that perhaps Lycurgus is a mythological figure, but also, of course, if he did exist, they would not have been using the language of democratia in the Iron Age of Greece. But what this tradition, as exemplified by Plutarch, shows is that Sparta was strongly associated with a rejection of democracy and a support for oligarchy. I would point out, though, that their own constitutional label was ambiguous, as Mayor Dukas has already mentioned. Oh, one other thing is that I should start over by saying that this association of Sparta with oligarchy is a little bit confusing, or at least inconsistent, because, of course, the earliest political document of Sparta, the Great Rítρα, as preserved in Plutarch's Lycurgus, states, and this, of course, is a corrupt passage, but we think we have the sense down, something like this: to the Demos of Sparta belongs perhaps the right of validation, if that's Kyria, but almost certainly power, kratos. So in a sort of almost a hinting at democracy avant la lettre, we see in the Great Rítρα this combination of Demos and kratos. So clearly the Demos was meant to have some kind of power in Sparta. And to return to my earlier point, their actual constitutional label was ambiguous. In Thucydides, we see that at one point around the Battle of Mantinea, the Boeotians and Megarians thought that the Argives' democracy was less beneficial to their oligarchic regimes than the constitution, that is politeia, of the Spartans. If we were to go by Xenophon's essay Agesilaus alone, we would think that Sparta was a kingdom. He says, no other government is known to have gone through a long period uninterrupted, neither democracy, nor oligarchy, nor tyranny, nor kingdom, but this kingdom alone persists continuously. Of course, this has to do somewhat with the fact that he is praising the king of Sparta, and so, of course, he would highlight its monarchical aspect. But then, beginning with Plato and following him, his student Aristotle, we get the idea of Sparta as a mixed regime that combines elements of aristocracy, democracy, and monarchy. On this front, I would draw your attention to a little-known document that has been given scholarly treatment recently. This is a so-called forgotten fragment of a Socratic dialogue on papyrus. It was originally published in the 1940s. There were editions by Merkelbach and others. It's recently been re-edited by Christian Vassallo in ZPE, and he has further discussions of this text. But at one point in the dialogue, one of the speakers, who we think is probably Socrates, says, "So why is the ability to speak more useful in a democracy than in an oligarchy, or why here rather than in Sparta? Or does the constitution here appear to you to differ from that in Sparta in this respect, that the ones who deliberate and speak here are many, they're few, and again, do you consider the constitution here a form of democracy, there of aristocracy?" So this is a very interesting dialogue for labeling Sparta an oligarchy, but we see immediately the speaker sort of hedges and redescribes it as an aristocracy. By the way, Vassalo believes that this is a lost dialogue by the philosopher Antisthenes, the student of Socrates, for what it's worth. But this is all just to say that Sparta's own constitutional form was up for debate. What I want to do in this talk, as I mentioned in the description that went out before, is to look mainly at classical sources, at things said by, to, and in the presence of Spartans about democracy, to try to get a sense of what they thought of it, what their going assumptions were about it, and to answer my question why they disliked it. So I'm going to be looking almost exclusively at classical historiography, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, and to a lesser extent bringing in Plutarch when I think that his sources go back to the classical period. I should point out that one source I'm not going to look at, which maybe I should, is the Old Oligarch and his Constitution of Athens. The addressee of that document is arguably a Spartan because the speaker imagines them, being in Sparta. In Sparta, my slave would be afraid of you. But it's unreliable as a description of what a Spartan would think, and I'm going to limit myself to historiography. But you could also look for mentions in old comedy, tragedy, philosophical dialogue. But I'm going to start with the historians. And the form of the talk will be a series of close readings, really, for which you will have both my translation and the Greek. And some of these I wish to interject my own opinions and even maybe raise some controversial points of interpretation. But let's get started. So my one passage from Herodotus. This is a famous moment from Book 5 in which the Spartans are leading the tyrant family of Athens that has previously been deposed by them, by the Spartans. This is Hippias of Athens. They're supposedly going to restore the tyrants to Athens, putting down the democracy in the process. And in drawing together their military allies, this one individual, Socles the Corinthian, makes this famous speech to the Spartans opposing what they're doing. Right? This is in the late 6th century BCE. And Socles begins his speech this way: "Indeed, heaven will be beneath the earth, and the earth above heaven, and people will have their dwelling place in the sea, and fish where people used to dwell, when you, Spartans, put down isokratiae and prepare to introduce tyrannies into the cities." Now, this term isokratia, scholars have traditionally taken it to be a kind of abstract political concept along the lines of, let's say, isonomia, equality of political rights. I wonder, though, in this passage, since it's in the plural and it is the subject of the regular verb for putting down a form of government, and furthermore, it is in a parallel position with tyrannies, whether we are not looking here at a form of constitutional rule along the lines of democratia, but also aristocratia, gynecokratia, so the rule of the people, or the power of the people, the power of the best, the power of women. Perhaps we should interpret this, I think, as a power of equals. And so the label would describe both the Athenian democracy, which is certainly a government of equals, but it would also describe any non-tyrannical oligarchy in which those who rule, not all of the citizens, but a few of them, nevertheless do have equal rights to each other and equal access to power in the government. And so this would be an attempt to put the Spartans on the back foot by showing them that democracies are maybe different from you, but they're still closer to you than you are to tyrannies. And it's meant to capture the Spartans' sympathy without alienating them by speaking of democratia directly. So the Spartans are, I think, meant to they're put in a situation where they're supposed to place aside their normal hostility to democracy and acknowledge that democracy, no less than they, is a form of isokratia. Coming back to this. Moving now to Thucydides, several passages from Thucydides here. We have a famous moment from Book 1, in which the Athenians respond to the Spartans' call for aid after the famous earthquake of 465 BCE. The Spartans and Athenians nominally still allies at this point after the Persian Wars. And the Spartans bring the Athenians in, but then as the siege goes on, so Thucydides says, the Spartans, fearing the Athenians' daring nature and their revolutionary spirit, neothoropoia, and at the same time considering them foreigners, afraid lest, should they stay, they might be persuaded by those on Ithome to take some revolutionary action, dismiss them alone of the allies. So here we see the Spartans worry that there will be a kind of overlapping of interests between the Athenian democracy on the one hand and their own enslaved class, the Helots, who are the ones being besieged on Ithome, on the other. So there's something about democracy in the Spartans' eyes that is connected with a revolutionary spirit, as Thucydides says, identifying also, though, with movements from below, as it were, and potentially going to ally with them. Another passage in Thucydides. So in Book 3, we have the end of the siege of Plataea, this polis in Boeotia. This had been the initial act, actually, of a hostile act of the Peloponnesian War, in which some Plataean oligarchs received Thebans into the city and attempted to take it over. The city was then besieged by the Spartans and others and capitulated, at which point the Spartans sent out 5 judges who simply asked the Plataeans who had survived whether they had done anything for the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. It's a very ominous request that, of course, the Plataeans couldn't answer, but they did ask, they begged leave to give a defense speech before the Spartans, in which they accused the Plataean oligarchs and the Theban oligarchs of attacking them dishonestly, and then the Thebans defend themselves in turn before the Spartans. And this is what the Thebans say about the Plataean oligarchs in the Spartans' presence. They say, the Plataean oligarchs were citizens just like you, and with greater interests at stake. They opened their own gate and brought us into their own city in a friendly, non-hostile fashion. They wanted the worse, Cherus, among you not to become even more so, and the better to have their just deserts. To be moderators, sophronistai, of your policy, while not depriving the city of your persons, but restoring it to its kin. So there's several things going on here. The Thebans seem to assume that the Spartan audience will respond favorably to the idea that there are worse among the Plataean democracy, that there are worse citizens compared with the better, and that until the introduction of these oligarchs, the worse were in danger of growing even worse in the future. And the better sorts of citizens were not going to have what was properly coming to them, what they deserved, taaxia. Furthermore, that the city was in need of sophrosune, of moderation, and that the oligarchs would introduce a spirit of moderation into the city that would temper the excesses of democracy. So this language of worse and also this language of sophrosune is going to be very important going forward. A further passage in Thucydides from Book 4, in which the very famous Spartan commander Brasidas is campaigning in the north, in the Chalkidiki. He has come to the city of Acanthus, and he wants to break the Acanthians away from the Athenian Empire. The Acanthians, however, are understandably rather worried that this will come with the dissolution of their democratic regime and the imposition of an oligarchy, which is, after all, Spartan normal practice. But Brasidas attempts to assuage the community. He says, quote, I have not come to be a partisan, nor do I think I would be bringing you genuine freedom if, bypassing tradition, I were to enslave the majority to the few, or the lesser part to the whole. There's something interesting here, which was noted long ago by Kurt Rafflaub, among others. The language of, we're talking, of course, about the few and the many, the demos and the oligoi. And, okay, the demos is afraid of oligarchy, of being subjected to the slavery of, or the mastery, rather, of the few. But look at what the oligarchs are worried about. They're worried about the lesser part being subjected to the whole, tois pasi. And Rafflaub pointed out that this is oligarchic ideology in action, because of course Democrats wanted to insist that in Democratia, the demos represented all of the citizenry, rich and poor together, whereas the oligarchic critique is that this all-encompassing understanding of demos masked a reality of political domination by the poor majority. So the whole for oligarchs was always a kind of ruse or lie, and the reality behind it was the subjection of the good few, as they would understand it, to the mass poor. And I think that Brasidas probably shares this ideological position. I'm coming now to one of the most important pieces of evidence for me, but also one of the most controversial. This is Ocus conclamatus in the text of Thucydides that I want to examine afresh. This is a speech, again, by Brasidas to his Peloponnesian allies and others before engaging in battle with some northern tribes and northern Greeks in general, including the Macedonians. And this is Thucydides, Book 4, Section 126. And Brasidas is trying to assuage their fears that they are fewer, considerably fewer than their opponents. Their numbers are smaller. And also they don't have as many allies as they would like. But he expresses himself to his allies, and even though they aren't all Peloponnesians, he addresses them as Peloponnesians at the beginning of the speech. And he says, quote, a very convoluted sentence, "It's fitting that you be brave men in war, not merely when allies are present, but through your inherent courage, and fear no mass of other men, you who have not come from such constitutions, in which it is not the many who rule the few, but rather the lesser the fewer, having gained power by no other means than conquering in battle." I've given a very literal translation of that. As you can see, the difficulty arises from the proliferation of negatives. The Peloponnesians are said to come not from such constitutions, politei, in which it is not the many who rule the few. And so if we just reverse the meaning and take out the negatives, it should mean you have come from such constitutions in which the many rule the few. That has troubled commentators because up until the mid-20th century, most assumed that, of course, Brasidas addressing Peloponnesian allies would be addressing oligarchs who came from cities where the few ruled the many. And so there have been some emendations proposed. You can see Stephanus's change from ou poloi to hoi poloi. But most commentators, again, up until an important intervention by Gaume in 1951, thought, okay, Thucydides' meaning here is a little convoluted, but surely it means that he's addressing Peloponnesians who come from oligarchic cities. Gaume rejected this view in an article from Classical Review in 1951. He claimed, quote, "Brasidas is slightingly referring to the large numbers of the enemy who are no better than slaves of a small ruling clique, now being driven into battle by their rulers. You must not be afraid of any number of such men as these. His troops were not in fact Spartans, and men from Mantinea, Tegea, Phlius, and other Peloponnesian cities, not to mention the Chalcidian and Acanthian levies, the Helots in Brasidas' army are altogether forgotten, would not have recognized a description of themselves as citizens of states with military dynastii at the head, and would not have been complimented by it if they had. Within the majority, the sound hoplite burghers did rule." So Gaume's argument is for taking the text as it stands quite literally and saying that Brasidas is in fact addressing his troops as men who come from places where the many rule the few. And he's been followed here by Hornblower in his commentary on Thucydides. And so the two major Anglophone understandings of the text of Thucydides from the last century are in agreement on this. And so I'm nervous to push back against this view, considering the stature and wisdom of the scholars in question. But I actually do think we need to go with the traditional understanding that he is addressing oligarchs. And I have 4 considerations here when I say this. One thing that neither Horn, and we're going to get into the weeds here a little bit. So I beg, patience from people who are maybe not into textual criticism, but it's pretty exciting. So one thing I see neither Gom nor Hornblower address is the language of the scholiasts to the text of Thucydides. So if we go to the passage in question, a scholiast has written toiuton tin demokratia lege, such constitutions, he means democracy. So the scholiast understood Thucydides Brasidas as saying, you do not come from democracies. You do not come from such constitutions. You do not come from democracy. So here's prima facie evidence that that's how ancient readers, or at least one, understood the meaning of the passage. The other big thing is that, of course, again, the situation is that Brasidas is trying to assuage the worry of his Peloponnesian allies that they are outnumbered by their opponents. And so it makes sense to me that the meaning of his sentence ought to be, you ought not to fear mere numbers of men, because you are the few who rule over many at home. And Jacqueline de Romilly, in her Boudet edition, says the fact that Brasidas is addressing himself to troops less numerous seems just to impose the traditional interpretation. He's showing his men that number is not everything. And I agree. I think that has to be the point of Brasidas's expression. Third, again, go back to that famous statement in Thucydides 119, where he says that the Spartans maintained their hegemony by making sure that most of their allies were governed by oligarchies. And I think that there's no way we can try to massage the meaning of oligarchia here in Thucydides to make it compatible with the notion, as Gom would have us believe Brasidas means, that in the Peloponnesian cities, the many rule over the few. There were, of course, exceptions in the Peloponnese. Places like Mantinea and Elis, as we will see later, were indeed democracies. But I think the sort of modal member of the Peloponnesian League was governed by an oligarchy, and that's what Brasidas is trying to tap into here. I also happen to believe that, Pache, what Gom says about the hoplite burghers forming a majority, I think what I've tried to show in my own work is that classical Greek oligarchies were much narrower than this model of the hoplite republic that we're often told about. One last consideration, it seems that there's an overlooked passage here that shows that constitutional politics in the Peloponnese really does happen according to the way that Brasidas would have us understand, that people hold power by overcoming their enemies in battle, in bouts of civil war. This is an episode from later in Book 5, shortly after the Battle of First Mantinea in 418, where the Argive democracy is overthrown and an oligarchy established. But then shortly afterwards, according to Thucydides, the Argive demos gradually regrouped and, taking heart, attacked the few. A battle, Mache, took place in the city, and the people prevailed, epikratesen. Now, this language of Mache and kratos comes up several times in Thucydides, but otherwise only in the context of actual war between opposing armies. This is the only instance I've found outside of the Book 4 passage in Brasidas' speech that is talking about an episode of stasis. And so it seems that enemies overcome their opponents in a battle, and that's how you establish your constitutional form. Here, the demos did it to the few, but Brasidas is saying that normally the few do it to the many. And I would just draw your attention to the language there of Thucydides 4:126, toi machomenoi kratein. And perhaps you disagree with me on this, but I think that what it shows overall is that Brasidas is trying to pump up his Peloponnesian allies by reminding them that they are the few, the proud, a band of brothers who shouldn't worry about numbers because they are used to governing a majority by force, if necessary. And of course, this reflects the Spartans' own position. They could identify with this view since they had conquered their neighbors in the immediate Peloponnese and Laconia and Messenia and held them in subjection as well. I'll be coming back to that. Now to bring in a final text, which will serve as a separate item in my little collection of texts here, which seems to me to display the same ideology about doing down mere numbers. This is the famous episode from Plutarch's Life of Agesilaus. So we're talking about the 4th century BCE. And this is when, quote, the allies of the Spartans were saying that they had no desire to be ground down here and there, year in and year out, moreover being so many men following so few. Here it is said that Agesilaus, wishing to refute their point about their numbers, contrived the following measure. And you may recall that he has the whole army sit down, the Spartans on one side, the allies on the other, and then a herald asks all of the carpenters to stand up, all of the potters to stand up. Anyone who has a techne or craft or who works for a living is made to stand up. So, as Plutarch continues, so almost all the allies stood up, but none of the Spartans, for it was forbidden for them to perform or learn a manual craft. Agesilaus laughed at this and said, "You see, gentlemen, to what degree we send out more soldiers than you." So again, we have a denigration of mere numbers, the idea that a few men deserve their position of political supremacy if they are true or real soldiers. And in the Spartan understanding, that was, people who devoted all of their time to military training, or at least, they were not distracted from military training by a career or a craft, by labor, basically. Okay, so perhaps you'll dispute my understanding of Thucydides' Book 4, but I think that this passage bolsters it. Moving on, I'm almost done with Thucydides. Here we have the famous Alcibiades, the playboy, wild card of the Athenian democracy, who has defected to Sparta after the affair of the Herms and the Mysteries in 415. And he is justifying his political career before the Spartans in an attempt to win over their sympathy. And he says to them, most people know this passage because it describes democracy as acknowledged folly, or what everyone agrees is folly, homologumenes anoias. We'll get to that in a minute, but I think the rest of the passage is much more illustrative, actually, of how the Spartans perhaps thought about democracy. Alcibiades says to them, quote, "We tried to be a moderating force in political life compared with the prevailing license, the ekolasia. But there were others, both in previous times and now, who urged on the mob, the ochlos, to more wicked ends, taponerotera. These indeed drove me into exile. But we were the champions of the whole citizenry. We sensible men, of course, recognized democracy for what it was, and I know worse than anyone, inasmuch as I might complain about it, but there is nothing new to be said about what everyone agrees is folly." So again, it seems that Alcibiades assumes his Spartan listeners will assent to the notion that in a democracy, politicians come along who urge on the mob to things that are poneros, which really is more than wicked. It's like scumbag behavior or scoundrelly behavior. And note also that Alcibiades actually attempts to reverse that oligarchic ideology, the language of the whole. He's trying to gain sympathy by saying, I wasn't a partisan of a part of the city, but of all of the city, poor and wealthy included. So kind of going against that thing Brasidas said before, that no matter how much democracy may say that it is the rule of the whole, it's secretly the rule of the poor majority. But all of these things, I think, are very evocative of how the Spartans would look at Athenian democracy from afar. Okay, we can now move on to our third author. And these next few quotations will be shorter and require less exposition. But I'm actually going to begin with Xenophon's Anabasis. This is, of course, a text written much later, but purporting to describe events of the late 5th century BCE, when this group of mercenaries, of which Xenophon was a part, attempted to install Cyrus, this pretender to the throne, in power in Persia. And one of the fellow members of the 10,000 mercenaries is this Spartan Chrysophus. And Chrysophus and Xenophon get into this kind of youthful banter with each other, where they're joshing each other. They are having a little contest about, who's going to be best at stealing. Xenophon says, "Oh, well, you Spartans, you're trained to steal from a young age, so you'll be the best thief." And this is Chrysophus's rejoinder. He says, "I hear you Athenians are skilled at stealing the public funds, even though the risk to the thief is terrible, and your most powerful men, hoikratistoi, do it most of all. if in fact the most powerful among you are deemed worthy to exercise power. So there's a couple things going on here. First is this cliche, really, about Athens' demagogic politicians constantly stealing the public funds, right? Because they are lowlifes who are elevated to these positions of power, and they enrich themselves from the public purse. So we can find this charge, as you see there at the bottom, in Aristophanes' comedy, in the Hellenica Oxyrhyncha historian, even in tragedy and in Attic oratory. Another thing happening here, though, is this little dig at the end. If, in fact, the most powerful among you are deemed worthy to exercise power, I think that Chrysoppus's meaning must be, oh, look, my fellow Spartiates and I, we are hoi kratistoi, and indeed we hold power in Laconia, but the guys that you are, electing or otherwise promoting to your head political positions, you aren't sending your best, right? The hoi kratistoi, people like me, are not actually elevated to positions of power in Athens. Understand, because the demos selects its leaders badly. Another passage in the Anabasis, in the final book. So these two Spartans, and they are Spartiates, have come from Fibron, this Spartan in Asia Minor, to maybe take over the 10,000 mercenary army from who are currently in the employ of this Thracian warlord Seuthes. And these two Spartans are conversing with Seuthes' ambassador here, Heraclides, and they ask about Xenophon. I suppose that Xenophon was told this information afterwards by one or both of the Spartans. When asked what sort of man Xenophon was, Heraclides answered that in other respects he wasn't bad, but he was friendly with the soldiers. In this regard, things were the worse for him. And they said, so the man plays the demagogue to the men, demagoge. Oh yes, Heraclides said. This passage has come up as evidence in recent scholarship for the valence of this term demagoguery, demagogia, or demagogane in classical literature. So you can see there in the note at the bottom some of the recent interventions on the valence of this term, because it's a rare term, really. It begins in Thucydides and Aristophanes, but it's still rare after that. And the question is whether it always has negative connotations, or whether it is a neutral term. I personally think it almost immediately takes on negative connotations, and I think that this is an excellent piece of evidence for that position. This is already in the late 5th century, around 400. You have people saying, glossing the situation as this guy is a bad guy because, or insofar as he plays the demagogue. What I want to emphasize here is what a lot of people don't tend to recognize, is that the people who supply the language of demagoguery in this case are Spartans. They're the ones who interpret Heraclides' statement as Xenophon carrying out demagoguery. So for them, this is them supplying the concept, which they obviously consider to be bad. So it seems that for Spartiates, the idea of being too friendly with the common man, of being a demagogue, was a bad thing. Moving to the Hellenica, just a few more passages left. So in Hellenica Book 3, we read about the Spartans growing angry at their king Pausanias. He had both failed, supposedly, to rescue Lysander at the Battle of Haliartus, and Lysander had been killed, and then combine that with the people retroactively saying, and you know what, you also really screwed up during the Athenian Civil War. The charge was that, quote, although he had the Athenian demos in his power in the Piraeus, he let them go. And it's true that Pausanias had effected the great amnesty at Athens. He had sent for reconcilers from Sparta who had reconciled the parties in the city and the Piraeus. So this is Xenophon's rather, artless language, not particularly interesting. The way that Plutarch glosses the situation, however, is more evocative. In Plutarch's description in the life of Lysander, the charge is that Pausanias, quote, let loose the demos, which had been bridled by the oligarchy, so that it once again broke out into hubris, exubrisai, and was made bold. So this becomes a whole lot more creative and interesting. And note that here we get this language of the demos as a wild horse, and it had been bridled by oligarchy, but it breaks free, or rather, Pausanias lets it loose, and it's free again to engage in hubris and to grow wild. And this might not be Plutarch's own reformulation, because we know that this kind of language was floating around in Athens in the 5th century BC. So elsewhere in Plutarch, in his Life of Pericles, we get this quotation of a lost poet of old comedy. This is unattributed fragment number 700 in the edition of Castle Austin. And Plutarch says that in the time of Pericles, quote, the comic poets say that, like a horse, the demos broke out into hubris. There's that exubrisanta language again, and quote, no longer submitted to obedience, but bit at Euboea and trampled on the islands. So of course the hubris language is Plutarch's own that he's supplying, but it seems that that is the assumption underlying the fragment of Old Comedy, that the demos becomes this out of control horse. And so I think it's not a stretch to think that Plutarch's language from the Life of Lysander, that Pausanias had let loose the demos, which had been bridled by oligarchy, could go back to language spoken at Sparta in the early 4th century, showing that the Spartans believed that unless properly regulated or moderated or held down by force, a demos was likely to break out into hubris. And further evidence for this assumption comes from our final passages from Xenophon. So around 400 BCE, Xenophon tells us that the Spartans, having been victorious in the Peloponnesian War, decide that they're going to punish their Peloponnesian allies who had been disloyal in various ways. And they begin with Elis, which was governed by a democracy. It had done several things in the intervening years to anger them. And so, quote, angry at these actions, the ephors in the assembly of Sparta decided to chasten the Eleans, sophronisai. Again, we get back to this language of moderation, moderating, that we saw in Thucydides' speech of the Thebans in Book 3. And so further evidence that the Spartans saw one of their roles as, you know, sort of chastening democracies that had grown out of control, because as I mentioned, Elias was a democracy at the time. And then later in the Hellenica, the famous instance of Phlius, the city in the Peloponnese, where at this point governed by a democracy, its governing majority was supposedly oppressing a minority who were not able to obtain justice in the law courts. And when they reached out to the Spartans for help, the Phliasian democracy fined them. And so the Spartans are quite angry at this, and quote, since the Phliasians truly appeared to be committing hubris, hubridzein, the ephors called out the ban against them. So here we have repeated notions of the idea, or repeated indications of the idea that the Spartans saw their role as regulating these democracies, which left to their own devices would grow hubristic. And I think all these passages nicely illustrate a phenomenon that Mirko Canavaro has written about recently, which will be appearing soon. He has this piece, The Hubris of the Downtrodden, Honor and Social Control in Ancient Greek Society and Today. That's in Douglas Cairns at LEE, Hubris, Ancient and Modern, from Ancient Athens to Brexit Britain and the COVID Catastrophe, forthcoming from Cambridge. And in this piece, Mirko discusses various, we usually associate hubris with acts from on high, you know, tyrants oppressing their people beneath them. But he shows that there were situations in which superiors thought that their inferiors were committing hubris against them by acting all out of you know, their role. And so he not only has instances showing hubris supposedly on the part of women and of slaves, but also a section on hubris by the lower classes. And it seems to me that that's what we're seeing here, is the Spartans believing that for a demos to act in certain ways towards their social superiors was to commit hubris, and the Spartans see themselves as rectifying that. Okay, so these 12 passages, or really 13, if you count 5a, constitute my sort of database here that I'm now going to summarize from, coming now to the the end of my remarks, and then I'm happy to hear your feedback. So what can we say based on all of these texts taken together? And I'm going to be showing the numbers of the texts here in my summary, and you can refer back on the handout if you want to see which texts those are. So it is true, we'll begin, that the Spartans, like Democrats, were to some degree citizens of a rule of equals, an isokratia. This is from number 1, and compare their ideology of being homoioi or similars, and also the rhetoric granted the demos in Sparta some kratos. So these are the hedges that make them different from an extreme oligarchy, let's say. Although, under my argument, isokratia can encompass a large number of oligarchic regimes as well. However, the Spartans were also, unlike other oligarchies and unlike democracies, a band of brothers that had conquered their more numerous neighbors, a state that depended on, but also perpetuated their status as all equally real soldiers. And remember, Agesilaus's supposed remarks is recorded by Plutarch, that only those totally freed from labor, like the Spartiates, could consider themselves real soldiers. Mere number, therefore, could not justify rule, especially on the part of men who were, quote-unquote, worse, herus, because they were neither free from labor nor the best and bravest, hoi kratistoi, hoi aristoi, as the Spartiates considered themselves. The rule of such men amounted to slavery for the good few. So it's, the fact that democracies were the wrong kind of demos. They were a demos, unlike the Spartan demos, which had not extricated itself from labor, the need to labor through conquest. So-called Benosic men, who could, ipso facto, not be real soldiers, as the Spartans understood it, tended towards, the Spartans believed, a lack of moderation, or sophrosune, and towards hubris. And many of the passages under consideration here, I think, go towards this understanding. Furthermore, democracy produced a leadership class that exacerbated these tendencies, especially insofar as the demos promoted unworthy men. And we get this especially from Xenophon's Anabasis, those crucial passages where Chrysophus mocks Xenophon for the Athenians elevating these nobodies to positions of leadership, and also the Spartiates worrying that Xenophon has engaged in demagogia, which is, of course, what happened on a daily basis in the Athenian democracy. And then finally, from their vantage point, the Spartans had a tendency to conflate non-Spartan Greeks with slaves and worried about a conspiracy between Deimos and Helots. And that gets us all the way back to the passage from Thucydides Book 1 about the Athenians' neotheropoia and the idea that they might be persuaded by the besieged Messenian Helots to join them. When I say that the Spartans tended to conflate non-Spartan Greeks with slaves, some of you may know of this article, or rather book chapter by Simon Hornblower, Sticks and Stones and Spartans, from Hans von Wese's 2000 book on war and violence in the ancient Greek world. And Hornblower points to numerous occasions on which Spartans were unable to play nice with their fellow Greeks, and in fact often actually struck them violently with their walking sticks, their bacteria. And one of Hornblower's arguments is that this is how they were used to treating all of those around them who were not also peers or Spartiatai, right? This is how they treated Helots. This is perhaps how they treated Hippomeones in these inferiors in Sparta. And so when they were thrust among fellow Greeks, this is how, the only way they knew how to play with people, as it were, right? And then they didn't play nice. And I think this problem is only exacerbated when they are dealing with lower class members of the Deimos, some of whom they were indistinguishable, as the old oligarch tells us, from enslaved people. And this made the Spartans very wary of such people and think that they might ally with their own enslaved class. So in summary, perhaps not a totally novel presentation of the Spartans, although I have argued for some interpretations of passages that might be controversial. But I do want to end by taking this picture and contrasting it with the situation of oligarchs, everyday oligarchs in the Greek world, because here the differences are informative. So for the Spartans, their mistrust of democracy is because any demos other than theirs, right, is one that is bonosic and therefore worse, and therefore has a tendency towards this lack of moderation. And their own rule was justified because they were supreme in battle over their neighbors. That in fighting they had overcome them, and they maintained themselves in that position. And for everyday oligarchs, of course, the only dividing line between those included and those excluded was wealth. That you could, as long as you were rich, you were granted participation in the Constitution, and it was this position of economic superiority that then from which all of their prejudices against the demos followed. But everyday oligarchs could not, although they might think of themselves, they might model themselves after Spartans or aspire to a Spartan condition, they had not done what the Spartans had done. They had not put themselves in the position of military supremacy that the Spartans had. And so as much as Spartans might be able to work with these people, understand them better than the demos, there's still a genuine difference between the Spartiates as a class and your typical oligarch of the classical Greek world. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. Stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this great presentation, great paper. I really enjoyed it. I would like to ask, I see that there is ready for a question. I would like first Mayor Dukas, if you would like to say something before we open the discussion to the audience, a question from the participants.
Yeah, excellent presentation, first of all. Many thanks. There seems to be a dichotomy between the Spartan equality and democracy within the Spartan area, and then the behavior of Spartans trying to get oligarchies as closer allies because the Athenians were out of control with their democratic parties around Greece, and they had to be somehow reined in. So let's say Sparta had equal public education for everybody. That's why they had this OMI class. Everybody's equal because we had the same education. We all knew who is who and who had merits and everything. Then you have the demos, and I think one of the areas that should be researched further, to me, the ephors must have been elected by lot and not by ballot. Because the senators were elected by ballot, the ephors must have been elected by lot between the Omi. That's the whole idea. And in Aristotle, you find some passages where if one thing is skewed in one way, the other should be by lot, which is more democratic. So the people probably felt okay and didn't revolt because they said, okay, I have an equal chance of being elected an ephor for 1 year, and therefore I'm fully represented. Is this something that you think is in line with your thinking? That there was indeed some sort of astute democracy within the borders of Sparta, but because of the pressures of Athens, they had to go with the oligarchies, which were more stable in terms of behavior, rather than the democrats, which by demagogues were brought right and left all the time.
Thank you so much for your question. It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about the ephorate and its selection process, but I agree. I would like to look more into that. I mean, what I would say is that although there's language in reality, so of course the Spartans called themselves homoioi, they nominally tried to have a baseline of some sort of social and economic equality amongst the Spartiate class and in their education. But even still, I think, just to be clear, my position is that even within the Spartiates, we don't have a democratic distribution of power. Dr. Asu, who's here, has this excellent piece in Classical Quarterly 2017 about how the Spartans arranged their decision making and how it favored, it was weighted in favor of the elite, let's say, in a way that wasn't true in the Athenian democracy. So, and there are many others here. I think Steve Hodkinson is here as well, who can tell us all about inequalities amongst the Spartiate class. But they did see themselves as equally the best warriors. I think that's the kind of equality that I'm talking about here. But thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I would like also to ask quickly a question first. I do agree with your view of these, let's say, ideology of oligarchy in action, basically, from the Spartan point of view that you showed. And I was wondering if in your research about Hellenistic demagoguery, you have seen a kind of continuity of these, let's say, elitist anti-democratic ideology also within the debate of the nature of Hellenistic democracy, because the passage, the point about Banausic work, and of course remind me, I think, to everyone the words of the old oligarch, as you also mentioned at the beginning of your paper. But I was also thinking about that famous passage in Polybius, which I think we have already discussed in another conference, about the famous assembly of the Achaean League that was packed by craftsmen, and I think it's in book 38 of Polybius, when Polybius, of course, says that the decision of the assembly of the Achaean League was basically not rational, not worth, because the pool that made the assembly was made of workers, of working class people. And so I do see a lot of continuity with, and which I think complements very, very well your point.
Thank you for that, Alberto. Yeah, I appreciate that. I know the passage well, and these kinds of critiques continue in the Hellenistic world about how democracies are basically allowed to run out of control because of demagogic influence in the assembly. So this is something, yes, that's there in Polybius, in other passages as well, in what we know of Hellenistic democracies from Diodorus Siculus. So yes, I mean, thank you for this opportunity to say that I do believe that the persistence of this so-called demagoguery that is already highlighted in our classical sources, but it absolutely continues in the Hellenistic sources, is evidence for the continuing vitality of democratic regimes in the Hellenistic period. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think the first question comes from Josina Block. If you would like to. Hello?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, hello all
Hello.
of you.
Hi.
So good to see you. Many thanks, Matt, for this wonderful talk. First of all, I really enjoyed it. I think it's very persuasive. I should like to respond to this passage that you already highlighted from Xenophon's Anabasis, the discussion with the Spartan colleague, where he says the Athenians do not, or something like, to the extent that he says the Athenians do not let the best of guys take power. And I do agree that it possibly means they elect all kinds of riffraff to be their leaders. But could it not also refer to the fact that many leaders or actually people in power who have the archai, that's the word there, are selected by lot, so that the best ones don't have a chance at all in getting at the positions that they deserve?
Yes, thank you, Josina. Yes, and I with all your work on the lottery, of course, this question makes excellent sense. I think that yes, I think that part of that is a critique about how nobodies are selected for these positions if you go by the ideology of the lottery. Of course, the Democrats would answer that, well, all of our citizens, right, are equally capable of participating in the archai. But yes, I mean, perhaps it must be, or some part of it must be that it's a critique of the lautocratic system, which is how the vast majority of these things were selected. But I think just to I have some work in progress about election in Athens and how it's actually more democratic than has traditionally been the case. So I'll if I have any luck with that paper, I'll send it to you. But I also think the elevation that Chrysophos has in mind is also the informal one of rhetors who are constantly, you know, their policies pass and they are looked to as the speakers in the assembly, which is an informal position, right? And I think he's thinking, and because those are often, these rhetors or demagogoi are often the ones who are accused of stealing in the fashion that that he says. But I think it must be both, yes.
Sure. Thank you. And I look forward to your paper on the election.
Thanks, Steve.
Hello, Matt. It's good to see you again, and thank you for a really very interesting paper. I think I agree with much of what you're arguing, except perhaps for the part where you focus upon the military aspects. And in particular, your passage 5a, the one from Plutarch's Agesilaus, I find it lacks credibility in two important respects. The first, that Agesilaus orders all the men from the among the Peloponnesians who practice various named handicrafts to stand up, but the passage totally omits working farmers, who surely represented the largest occupation group among the Peloponnesian League forces. And secondly, when all the Peloponnesians have sort of have stood up, the passage omits entirely the perioikoi, who would have formed the bulk of the Lacedaemonian contingent at this period, and many of them would have been practicing farming or handicrafts. So to me, the passage just lacks credibility, and I don't think it really provides the support that it might appear to at first sight. A couple of small points about two of your other passages. The passage 9, what you refer to as the castigation of King Pausanias. If I remember rightly, that text comes from the actual charges laid against Pausanias at his trial in 395. So that's likely to be not just Xenophon's account, but his summary of one of the three charges. And then your passage 7, the joshing between Xenophon and Chrysophos. Chrysophos' comment about the Athenians stealing a public fund is surely highly ironic, given the contemporary peculation by Spartan generals overseas, Gylippos and Thorax in particular. So I wonder whether Xenophon isn't being rather ironic in getting Chrysophos to make that criticism of Athenians.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, excellent points. I mean, in reverse order, I think you're absolutely right that Xenophon could be pointing out the hypocrisy of Chrysophos here. But of course, hypocrisy doesn't mean that a Spartan didn't actually believe that the Athenian leadership engaged in public theft of public funds, and that this was a defect of the democracy. I mean, I think it's such a common cliched charge that I think it's one that was quite widespread about the Athenian democracy. I mean, it's one that even its own internal critics, like Aristophanes, were constantly pointing out. So, but yes, I mean, there is some irony here, I think, that doesn't necessarily, though, detract from the main point about what Spartans thought of democracies. Yeah, I mean, I think you may be right that Xenophon is, taking the official line here in passage 9, and so that is what actually would have been, lodged, the charge that would have been lodged against Pausanias to the letter. I'm still open to the idea that Plutarch's language is not simply his own embellishment of Xenophon's, and that this parallel from this late 5th century Athenian text suggests that whatever the formal charge is, this may actually be a genuine tradition going back to how Spartans at Sparta talked about Pausanias. if not in the formal charge, then among themselves, that the Athenians had been bridled by the oligarchy, and he screwed up by relinquishing them. And then let's see, the other passage was about 5a. So yeah, there are ways in which it's perhaps too good to be true, because as you point out, where are the farmers? And once we introduce the idea that, well, surely most of these men would have been farmers, you know, then the episode falls apart, loses all credibility. It's not clear to me that farming isn't also a kind of techne. It's not a monastic one necessarily, although in some oligarchic eyes, I think it was. I mean, and literally men who worked the ground themselves. You know, there was a certain oligarchic prejudice against that, rather than having, you know, enslaved people and their overseers who took care of your estate for you. So it's possible that being a farmer, like a middling farmer, is included in this understanding. But yeah, I should thank you for flagging that. I should think harder about how genuine this passage could actually be.
Thank you. Is there any other question from, is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Yes, Matt, please.
Hi, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Just kind of a quick one coming on from one of the things we were talking about there. If the Spartans had this kind of dislike of democracy, what motivations do you think there might have been for King Pausanias to, in Xenophon's words, I think it's actively try to bring about the reinstatement of the democrats? Is it that he's just tired of having to march up from the Peloponnese to prop up the oligarchs?
That, and I mean, power politics, both international and domestic, often make strange bedfellows. So I think he's trying to undercut the influence of Lysander in Sparta. He doesn't want Athens to be a client state of this this guy who's not even a royal, right? How dare he have so much authority? And so it's similar to how, you know, the Thebans wanted Athens, the Theban oligarchs wanted Athens' destruction after the Peloponnesian War, and then immediately funded or supported the resistance against the oligarchy. You know, these are just, whatever their ideological inclinations, I think that these questions of power politics often cut across that, if that sounds convincing.
Yep, absolutely. I would agree with Lysander and Pausanias.
It looks like Stephen has his hand up again.
Another question? Yeah, you wanna? Yeah.
Well, my point is really just to follow on from Matt's question. I think there's partly a difference of time, that the passage that Matt's put before us is in 395, whereas Pausanias' intervention in Athens was 8 years earlier in 403, and he had the support of the ephors, and in particular the two ephors that were with him on the campaign in Athens, and also he took care to refer things back to Sparta and get their approval, and they sent out a commission of men to oversee the settlement in Athens. So I think at the time it seemed like a realistic option to bring Athens into the alliance, into the Peloponnesian League alliance. By 395, Athens has just deserted Sparta and joins the Boeotians in their resistance to Sparta. So the political situation has changed, and it becomes appropriate, therefore, for Pausanias to be charged of having let the Demos go. In retrospect, it proved to be a disastrous policy, at least from the point of view of his critics.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, if we think about at least some of the accounts of the origins of the Corinthian War, right, it's this gold that goes precisely to the demagogues of the ancient Greek cities, and so the Spartans could look at that as no good deed goes unpunished. Look at these ungrateful, this ungrateful Athenian democracy is, of course they've let their scoundrel politicians lead them astray. So yeah, I think they might go together well.
Chrysanthi, do we have still time for questions? Or
Yeah, if we want one more question. You're muted.
is there anyone who would like to ask one more question before we finish our session for today? Well, if not, I would thank Matt very much for this great paper, really, really interesting. And I pass the Chrysanthi to you for the final greetings.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I'm not sure if Mayor Doukas is here. Still here? I'm not sure.
I don't think so. I don't think he's there.
You may have to leave earlier. So Matt, thank you very, very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking paper. There is definitely a lot to think about the Spartans and Spartan constitution, and we very much thoroughly enjoyed your talk today. We will be announcing very soon the new conference that the center will be organizing in partnership with the city of Sparta and the Society for Laconian Studies. And one of the panels will be about the Spartan constitution. So we very much hope that people will be joining us to discuss all these ideas in early Sparta. But we will be circulating the news very soon. This is just a pre-announcement. And so thank you, Matt, again, very, very much. I would also like to warmly thank Mayor Doukas and the City Council of Sparta, the University of Nottingham, and the marketing team of the School of Humanities for their continued support. And I would also like to thank very much Mr. Petros Kapernarakos and MoneySpace for media sponsorship. Above all, I would like to thank all of you who have attended today's talk here on Teams and on MoneySpace live stream. And we very much hope that you will be joining us again next week. That is on Thursday, the 2nd of February. We will be welcoming a dear Greek colleague, Aris Tsaravopoulos from the Hellenic Ministry of Culture, who will talk to us about Kythera and Laconia, a continuous dependent relationship. Now, if you wish to become a member of the Centre and receive our news and invitations to events, do email us at csps@nottingham.ac.uk. Have a very nice evening, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you. Bye.